Everyone, welcome to day 2 of Source Fashion London. Today we're going to be talking about a very special topic that's probably very interesting to all of you because over the past few years this has become a kind of changing area. I'm going to introduce Karen, who is going to tell you all about the new unilateral trade deal and legislation surrounding that.
Thanks very much. That answers my first question. Can you hear me? Yes, fantastic. So I'm delighted to be here and delighted to see that so many people are interested in the technicalities of the UK's tax regime for imports. So a real pleasure. We'll come on to the details of that. Let me first introduce my colleagues. We all work for the same civil service department. Sophie?
Hi, my name is Sophie Kinsey. I'm really interested in rules of origin for countries to import their garments in particular into the UK.
And Rupert.
Hi everyone, I'm Rupert Casson, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you.
So without any further ado, we'll launch into a very short set of slides. We have a website address that if you remember nothing else, remember that. You can find out much more. We can find out everything we're going to tell you today and more. And we will make sure we leave lots of time for questions and answers. So we'll just spend 10 minutes or so running through the basics of this new scheme. So Rupert, if we move to the first slide, see if we can get that. Thank you. So this piece of legislation came into effect in the UK exactly 4 weeks ago. So you're in right at the beginning on hearing about this. This is the Developing Countries Trading Scheme. It's the UK's unilateral preferences for imports of goods from developing countries. Can I just ask, how many of you are familiar with the European Union's Generalised Scheme of Preferences, the EU GSP? Just wave at me. Fantastic. So we've got people who know. Anybody else familiar with the GSP? Yeah. Okay, so we'll make sure that we'll give you lots of times to ask the basic questions and some of the really technical questions if you're familiar with that scheme. So until 4 weeks ago, we had a scheme in the UK that was very similar to the European Union scheme that still exists and has run for many years. We have spent more than 2 years designing a new policy, which we announced in the middle of last year, and then putting that policy into legislation in order to make our scheme in the UK simpler and more generous. So the initial reaction from a range of countries has, by and large, been positive. Little bit of sort of what do we need to do differently? But by and large, the actual content of the new scheme is seen as better than the scheme we had. So we've been and presented this scheme in Bangladesh, the biggest user of UK unilateral preferences. Our Foreign Secretary has presented it. We've been in Ethiopia, Rwanda, not us, but our colleagues. So we are very happy to be here today to make sure that you here and everybody you speak to also are aware that this is new legislation. Can we move to the next slide? So what are we doing now that we weren't doing 4 weeks ago? This is one of the most generous preferences schemes in the world, as far as we can tell from our comparisons. It's a unilateral scheme. It's not a bilateral trade deal. It covers 65 countries, and I'll show you which in a moment. So over 3 billion people live in those countries. The overall trade from those countries, not necessarily through this scheme, but the overall trade is over £23 billion a year. So these are important countries, companies like yourselves, who can potentially use this scheme. And what the scheme does is offer duty-free, quota-free access for all goods imported from least developed countries into the UK, everything but arms, and very generous tax reductions, tariff reductions for economically vulnerable, lower middle income countries. Just before I pass on to Rupert, you may ask yourselves, we're here from the UK government, we're keen to tell you how we can get less tax from you. And you might be saying, why? Part of it is, and the name of the department we work for is Trade for Development. We know that trade is an essential part of developing countries, growing economies, engaging with the global economy, and tackling poverty, increasing jobs, a whole load of things that are really important for those countries and for us to support. We also know by doing this that UK companies and customers get a much wider choice. Many of you will be familiar with countries that I'm about to show you on the map, but many of you will not or may not have thought of those countries as potential sourcing origins. So better choice for companies and for customers. And for us as a government, more trade is often a route into better relations across a whole range of issues, global issues, bilateral issues. So we also know that trade helps the broader UK relationship. So just let me very briefly show you the map of where the countries are. So you will recognize many of those. The least developed countries are colored in the lightest blue, many in Africa, but by no means only Africa. Those are the countries that can basically import any goods to the UK without quotas, without tariffs, everything but arms. The medium blue are the lower middle income countries, slightly more developed economies, but still economically vulnerable, still not diversified in their trade, and those countries benefit from this scheme with a much wider range of tariff reductions, and then a couple of countries that are in the scheme that have some goods in the scheme, that's India and Indonesia, with some tariff reductions. But let me pass now to Rupert to tell you a bit more about the technicalities.
Fantastic. Thank you, Karen. So I'm going to dive in and give a summary of the key policy changes in the scheme. It's important to note that these changes will make it easier for developing countries to export to the UK, but also make it easier and more economically viable for UK buyers to source from developing countries as well. I'm going to talk about tariffs, rules of origin, conditions, and goods graduation. So on tariffs, which is taxes, we've made major tariff cuts in the scheme. So 150 new tariff lines have been cut for enhanced preference countries. That's the middle tier that Karen talked about, economically vulnerable countries. We've also either removed or reduced nuisance and seasonal tariffs from the scheme. We've also made sure that more countries get those enhanced preferences. That's the middle tier that Karen talked about, which gives duty-free trade on 92% of goods, which is extremely advantageous. So 8 economically vulnerable countries, including Algeria, Tajikistan, and Nigeria, amongst others, will receive those preferences. It's important to note, as Karen mentioned, that least developed countries, so they're in the comprehensive, the most advantageous tier, will receive duty-free trade on everything but arms and ammunition. So 99% tax-free, which is fantastic. Rules of origin, for those that don't know, are the rules that determine a product's national origin by defining the minimum local content and processing required to qualify for preferential tariffs. We have made rules of origin a lot simpler because they can be difficult at the best of times and more generous for least developed countries. So we've increased the threshold of non-originating content to 75%, and Sophie's going to explain a bit about what on earth that means in a minute. We've also increased the alternative processing rules. So about 40% of the processing rules now have alternatives in the scheme. This basically means, in practice, that least developed countries have more options for meeting the rules of origin. It means it's easier for them to meet the rules of origin, and means there's more likelihood that they'll get their fantastic product to the United Kingdom. On rules of origin, we've also made a major positive change in extending accumulation for LDCs. So accumulation is where one country gets the raw materials from another country and they count as originating, which is fantastic because there's no threshold on originating materials for accumulation. So you can accumulate 100% of your goods. This extended accumulation for LDCs now includes 95 developing countries in the scheme, which is really advantageous. On conditions, we've made them clearer and broader. So we have a clearer and broader basis for suspension. Suspension is based on international conventions, but we've beefed this up to include conventions on climate change, and the environment, as well as the human rights and labor rights conditions that were in the previous scheme that still remain as well. For enhanced preference countries, those are the countries that receive duty-free trade on 92% of goods. That will be assessed purely on economic vulnerability. So there'll no longer be a need for them to ratify and effectively implement those 27 international conventions, but we do uphold the right to suspend countries from the scheme if those conventions are violated. Goods graduation is when goods that are deemed especially competitive, either with the UK market or with developing countries, are excluded from preferences in the scheme. So competitive products, particularly from India and Indonesia, continue to be excluded from preferential tariffs, and this will protect the interests of economically vulnerable producers of these goods. What do these changes actually mean? Well, our economists have calculated that the benefits of the tariff savings will equal £770 million per year. Up to $2 billion in trade will benefit by 2030. And with all of the changes, we've made what would be essentially a very complex scheme a lot easier to understand, increasing the chance of developing countries getting their fantastic products to the UK, and for UK buyers to source from developing countries as well. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sophie to talk about what this actually means in practice with a couple of examples.
Thanks, Rupert. So I'm just going to give a couple of rules of origin examples. There are potentially hundreds of rules of origin examples, so we're just going to pick two. If you do have more questions about this, I will be around, happy for you to come up and ask me if you've got a particular scenario and you don't quite understand whether your particular products will qualify. So first example is regional accumulation. So this is the same setup as in the UK GSP. There are specific groups of countries in Asia that can accumulate with each other. And we've retained the same groupings in our scheme. So these sets of countries, Group 1 and Group 2, can accumulate with each other. That means that if they source anything from any country within that group, we will consider it as originating. So let's give you an example. So we've taken a bra as an example. So all the countries here in this example at the bottom are within the same regional group. So if a Sri Lankan company that's making lingerie wants to source the cotton from India, the metal straps from Pakistan, and the foam from Bangladesh, all those products which aren't sourced from within Sri Lanka, because of the regional accumulation rule, we will consider them as originating in Sri Lanka, which means that Sri Lanka can therefore benefit from the zero tariff when they then go on to export their products to the UK. One important thing to add, though, is the production phase. We have very strict processing rules within the scheme, so you can source your materials from within the region, but you have to do the construction and go beyond simple manufacturing of the bra, in Sri Lanka in this case, in order to qualify for the zero tariff. Another thing to quickly add, this is intra-regional accumulation, but we also have an option within our legislation for inter-regional accumulation. So it's actually possible to apply to source your raw materials from a country in the other group. So if we go back to our example at the bottom here, Sri Lanka could potentially source one of these products from Group 1. They could apply, they can write to us in our department and ask if they can source from one of the countries in Group 1, and that may well be possible. So that's one option that not that many people are aware of. Can we go to the next slide? So this is a different scenario. This is if you're sourcing and you're a least developed country. So Sri Lanka is not a least developed country, they're an enhanced preference country. So both Karen and Rupert have been talking about the different way we treat countries in the scheme. There's 3 frameworks. So the previous example was for that middle framework country. So this is an LDC example, and they have much more generous rules of origin under the new scheme, significantly more generous. And one of them in particular is this permitting up to 75% non-originating content. So this is different accumulation. This is where a least developed country, so one of the 47 least developed countries in the scheme, in some chapters, half of all chapters in our new scheme, they can source 75% of the raw material from anywhere in the world. So our example here, You could source, if you're making shoes, you could source your synthetic fibers from China. That's perfectly permitted. You could source your dyes from China. You could even source, we've got Germany and Austria as examples here, but you could source your adhesives and even your wood all from China. That would be fine as long as it didn't equate to more than 75% of the value of the shoe. Then remember I said really important processing. All the construction of that shoe has to take place in your LDC. In this example, it's in Ethiopia, in order to export those final leather shoes to the UK and pay zero tariff. So that's just an example of the 75% rule. I'm going to stop there. If you're still confused how it works, find me and I will see if I can answer your questions about a different sort of product and whether it would qualify or not. So I think I'm going back to Rupert. Yeah.
Yeah, most importantly, as Karen mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we've put all the information that you could possibly want to know about the scheme on our one-stop shop info on gov.uk. So now Wimbledon's finished, or when you're in the coffee queue, please just take 2 minutes and check it out, because we've got everything you could possibly want to know, both as a UK buyer trying to source from developing countries and developed manufacturers in developing countries themselves. I've just taken a couple of screenshots of what we've got on our gov.uk page, and I'll share the link at the end. It's also worth noting that all three of us will be here today, and we do like talking to people, so please do come up to us, ask us questions about the scheme. We've also got some flyers as well we'd be happy to give out. Thank you. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see that we've created this interactive tariff tool. This has everything you want to know about tariffs, split by product basis. So if you want to export socks, say from Ethiopia to the United Kingdom, or if you're a buyer trying to source socks from a developing country, you can look on here, see the tariff rate, country by country basis. You can see the trade flows between the United Kingdom and developing countries. You can also have a live lookup tool to look up the rules of origin. So they're the processing rules that we talked about earlier. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see we've created 6 detailed guides on everything you could possibly want to or even not want to know about the developing countries trading scheme. Everything from breaking down all the case study examples of all the different types of accumulation in rules of origin. We've got a guide on standards that need to be met to trade into the UK. We've got everything from regulatory environment and also a further explanation of tariffs as well. The main kind of emphasis of today is, please, if you want to reach out to us, do email us at our inbox, which is on the screen there, dctsinquiries@fcdo.gov.uk. And please also do look at our gov.uk page. The scheme came in on 19th of June, so it was a couple of years of policy work behind the scenes, but now the real hard work starts, and we want to work with you as closely as possible, both on the developing country side and on the buyer side, to make the scheme a fantastic success. I'll pass back to Karen for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've got a few minutes for questions and answers. So I'm looking to some of the people who are already expert and some of the people who maybe are less expert. We also are working with the International Trade Centre, who are supporting businesses who are eligible for this scheme, but also helping us make sure that everybody knows. So Delphine, I'm going to ask you to put our brochures on the stands of the 13 companies that are here. So if you'd like a brochure, please go and look at the Ethiopia and Madagascar companies. You'll find that it has a reminder of the website address. Questions? Who would like to start us off, please?
Wait for the mic.
Are the customs processes the same under this new scheme as they were under the old scheme?
That's a brilliant question. I know who knows the answer.
Yes, thank you. We quite often get that question. So they are actually the same. The paperwork, the proofs of origin requirements under the UK GSP, the scheme that's just expired, are exactly the same under the new scheme. So those of you who might be involved in that, it's something called the Form A, same paperwork. And also, to make it easier for businesses, we've allowed a grace period from now until the 31st of December, that if you've got goods on the way, they've already left and they're on a container ship, and they've got the UK GSP paperwork, that's still valid on entry into the UK up until the 31st of December. And also, if you've got goods in bonded warehousing that you put in there under the UK GSP proof of origin, that's fine. If you bring that out of bonded warehousing up until the 31st of December, we will recognise that paperwork.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to this side of the room now, and in part because some people said you're very familiar with the previous scheme. Any questions from this side of the room? Microphone, thank you.
Obviously, when you open up a lot of lesser developed countries to sourcing by British businesses, that sort of opens the door, unless you're monitoring it very carefully, to exploitation, potentially. What is the government doing about that in terms of sort of who's sourcing and how they're treating the people that they're sourcing from?
So again, that's a really interesting and important question. There's a lot of different ways of addressing that. So some of that will actually come from companies who are buyers and who are saying, we will not source from you unless you can tell us that you have in place labor conditions would be a typical one, also sustainability conditions. So we know that the private sector are a big driver of better standards. It's part of, as I said at the beginning, why we're not taking the tax from you and spending it in ways we think, because we know that you also, as buyers, will be concerned about those issues. But we are concerned about those issues. So within this scheme, the Developing Countries Trading Scheme, as Rupert mentioned, there are very clear procedures where we would potentially start conversations with countries, so government level, if we were thinking there might be serious and systematic violations of a whole range of international conventions. Those international conventions within the scheme have always covered human rights and labor rights. They now also cover anti-corruption and climate and environment. We don't do that lightly. And the process is based on trying to encourage dialogue with country governments, so a warning and assessment procedure. And for us, if we did go into a warning procedure, we would hope that actually suspending preferences was not the conclusion of that warning, that some other actions were happening, because changing preferential access to the UK disrupts a lot of trade and all of those benefits. We also, as the UK government, are very active in the multilateral system, so the Human Rights Council, for example, and we use some taxpayers' money for official development assistance for programs and projects which specifically look at improving working conditions and good governance within the countries more broadly than this particular scheme. Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to come over here now, people lurking at the back. Any more questions? There's no such thing as a silly question, as you know, so any question is a good question. Anything that caught your imagination in this? No? Then Sophie, I'm going to turn to you because you know from other sessions that we've run the sorts of questions we quite often get asked.
Yes, we get one question a lot. So since you're here listening, I'm going to tell you the answer in case someone asks you. We get a lot of questions about countries that are about to graduate from least developed country status, and some of those are big garment manufacturers, particularly Bangladesh, but also Cambodia and Nepal. And those three are due to graduate from least developed country status in 2026, 2027. We, in our scheme, then allow countries that are least developed countries that graduate to remain, we treat them as a least developed country for an additional 3 years. So there's a 3-year transition period. So if we take Bangladesh as an example, Bangladesh graduates from UN LDC status in 2026. We then give them a 3-year transition period. So they will leave least developed country status in 2029. Now, that matters because the tariff rates and the rules of origin will then differ for Bangladesh. They're not as generous, and they will move into the middle bracket called the enhanced preferences. But Bangladesh is particularly happy with our scheme because we've changed the rules of how you qualify for those enhanced preferences, which Rupert and Karen have already talked about. So Now, there's less of a cliff edge when countries graduate from LDC status. So rather than going to that least generous rates, which at the minute only India and Indonesia gets, they actually can move more gradually into the 92% duty-free, quota-free bracket. So if you're working with those countries that are looking to graduate in the next few years, this scheme will help you. So there will still be quite generous tariff preferences after countries graduate. Now, I had a few people nodding there, so I think that was a useful piece of information. But back to Karen if there are any more questions.
Thank you. So we're getting to the end of our time, and we do not want to get caught up in the catwalk that's happening straight afterwards. So last chance for any last-minute burning questions? If not, I'm just going to put Delphine on the spot and just say, could you just indicate for everybody here where the companies are, where these leaflets will be available? Microphone? And Delphine, do people already know you? Do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Hello, everybody. I'm Delphine. I work at the International Trade Center. It's the joint agency of the WTO and UN. And we're supporting, thanks to UK funding, companies from Ethiopia, sustainable companies from Ethiopia and from Madagascar to exhibit here and to try to enter the UK market. Over there, Madagascar and Ethiopia, somewhere also at the back here. So please come and visit them, and we can further engage and discuss. Thank you.
And pick up a leaflet with that website address and our email. So thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure talking with you. Really pleased to see so many people interested. Enjoy the rest of your time today, and come and ask us questions when you can find us. Thanks.